How much processing power do you actually need? Apple's M1 Max was one of the fastest chips we have ever tested, especially in a laptop. But the M1 Ultra in the new Mac Studio takes two Maxes and crams them together. It is probably the fastest computer Apple has ever built. But starting at a hefty $4,000, is it actually useful? Welcome to Upscaled, our explainer show, where we seem to these days mostly just be endlessly retesting the many versions of the M1 chip that Apple keeps cranking out. Now, when the M1 Ultra and the Mac Studio were first announced, we put out the call to you to see what tests you would like us to run on the new M1 Ultra, and you had some great ideas. Now, to be fair, too many of you still seem to be struggling with the idea that this is a Mac and can't run Windows software, but despite that, there were some great suggestions. We've got a bunch of video encoding tests in Premiere Pro. We're going to check out Blender. We've got tests using DaVinci Resolve and Fusion, Lightroom, a bunch of AI and processing tests, and even some games. Let's take a look. For more info on how the Mac Studio actually is as a computer, check out our colleague Devindra's full review on the website. But for a brief overview, the M1 is Apple's in-house line of chips. After years of relying on Intel, Apple kicked Big Blue to the curb and developed their iPhone and iPad chips into a new line of SoCs for laptops and desktops. Now, SoC means this is a processor, a graphics card, and a shared pool of memory all together on a single chip. These M1s are based on the ARM design, which has traditionally been focused on low-powered, efficient operation, like those in phones. But Apple is hoping these chips will compete with the top desktop designs from companies like Intel, AMD, and Nvidia. The previous flagship, the M1 Max, had 10 CPU cores, a mix of 8 performance cores and 2 low-powered efficiency cores, along with up to 32 graphics cores and up to 64 gigabytes of shared memory. When we tested out the M1 Max in the 16-inch MacBook Pro, we were pretty amazed at how fast it was and without roaring fan noise or getting uncomfortably hot. The M1 Ultra is literally just two M1 Max chips fused together with a high-speed connection and acting as one single chip. Now, this means 20 CPU cores, up to 64 graphics cores, and up to 128 gigabytes of RAM. And all of that is packed into the surprisingly compact Mac Studio chassis, which looks sort of like a fat Mac Mini. We took a fully loaded M1 Ultra Mac Studio along with a second Mac Studio with the M1 Max chip and the two laptops we'd already tested, the 16-inch MacBook Pro also with an M1 Max and a 14-inch MacBook Pro with the lower powered M1 Pro, and we compared them across a gauntlet of tests. For contrast in all of these was my PC desktop with its 16-core AMD 5950X processor, 128 gigabytes of RAM, and now sporting a shiny new EVGA NVIDIA RTX 3080 Ti. Farewell, Radeon 7, you served me well. As we ran through the tests you requested and a few others we thought up ourselves, I had 4 main questions that I was trying to answer. First, how well does the M1's performance actually scale? In other words, is the M1 Ultra actually twice as fast as an M1 Max? Second, with a larger heat sink, better cooling, and a direct line to wall power, is the M1 Max chip in the Mac Studio faster than the same processor in a laptop? Third, as more and more software is supporting the M1 architecture, are we seeing a performance increase from our past tests? And finally, is the M1 Ultra worth it? The computer that Apple sent us would retail for $6,199, which may be cheap for a professional Apple machine, but is still incredibly expensive for a computer. Now, in a lot of their promotional and marketing material, Apple is comparing a machine like this against a desktop PC with a high-end processor and an NVIDIA RTX 3090 GPU, which is a $1,500 graphics card. But is that performance within reach? Essentially, for the price, does this computer make any sense at all? So, a few notes on testing here. Turns out I am not actually very well equipped to set up a whole bunch of extra desktop computers in my house, especially not with a under 1-year-old running around right now. These are actually set up in what is my weirdly fancy garden shed. So that's where we are at the moment. Also, I don't have a ton of spare monitors. I kind of need the ones I have to do my actual main job. So all I was able to really find was this one single old 1080p screen, which I've been swapping back and forth between the two studio desktops. And it also does have this giant black line through it. So we're just trying to work around that. When running a lot of the tests, I tried to use screen capture to show what's going on, but I want you to know I didn't actually factor in any of the test data that we gathered while the QuickTime screen capture was running. I'm aware that like messes with performance. So if you see screen cap stuff, consider that to be like for demonstration purposes only. Though this is also not forensic computer science, partly because I'm trying to get real world tests, and also I'm trying to suss out what's actually happening inside these M1 chips. Most of the time when I was doing anything, I did have, I will admit, not just one, but in fact, two different performance monitors running at any given time. This was able to tell us a lot. I realize it probably means the performance is not 100% accurate, but consider it like a real world test. Do you close every single window before exporting a project or like opening a Lightroom catalog? No, you're streaming Netflix all the time, aren't you? So consider it a real world test. Finally, when possible, we ran multiple tests and averaged the results together. So the numbers we're showing you on screen might not exactly match the footage. All right, onward to the benchmarks. One of the very first requests that we got when we put out the call here was for 3D Mark's Time Spy, which is a fantastic gaming and graphical performance benchmark, which is of course Windows only. Yeah. Fortunately, 3D Mark has actually recently put out Wildlife Extreme, which is another gaming and graphics benchmark, which it is actually technically kind of mobile first, but it does run natively on the M1, and it has a so-called unlimited mode that essentially kind of does the rendering off screen, as it were. It does all the processing, not taking into account the performance of the display that you actually have hooked into the computer, which makes it really good for comparing across a bunch of different devices. Our M1 Pro MacBook scored at 10,419, the M1 Max laptop managed 20,210, and the M1 Max Studio scored a whopping 20,327. The Ultra, by comparison, scored 3,442 and over 200 frames per second, though that was still a ways behind the PC. And that pretty much answered question number 2. In this test and a number of others, the difference in performance between the M1 Max chip in the 16-inch MacBook Pro and the Mac Studio was 1%, maybe 2%. And while in most of the tests I saw, the Mac Studio was slightly ahead, sometimes it flipped and the laptop was actually faster. Once I saw this result enough times, I gotta be honest, I stopped the hassle of swapping my one poor monitor back and forth between the two Mac Studios, and I just ran most of the M1 Max benchmarks on the laptop. Since our last round of benchmarks, 3D modeling software Blender has also released a new version that natively supports rendering on the M1. In addition to this, they also have a new version of the Blender benchmark, which I will continue to insist on calling the Blenchmark. I ran the Blenchmark along with a test in Blender itself using their fancy new splash screen image. In the CPU benchmark, the M1 Ultra scored 382, which is notable for being just a hair slower than twice as fast as the M1 Max. It was also within a few points of the AMD 5950 in my desktop PC. This is pretty impressive because the 5950 draws about 3 times as much power as the M1 Ultra, whose 20 cores seem to have a maximum power draw of about 50 watts. The GPU portion of the test was a little bit less impressive, with the M1 Max scoring 705, the Ultra getting 1,111, and my shiny new 3080 Ti scoring 5,276. Here's where we start to see answers to a few of those other questions. When it comes to the M1 Ultra's CPU performance, it really is just about double that of the M1 Max. And this is a pretty big accomplishment. Adding more cores does not reliably increase performance in a straight line. Just adding more cores onto a chip frequently adds to overhead, as jobs have to be broken up and split between all the different processing cores, and the latency of shuffling data around an increasingly big chip. Adding an extra core, you might only expect to get 50% additional performance instead of doubling it. But in multiple tests, including Blender, Luxmark, and Geekbench, the M1 Ultra is close to 2 times as fast as the M1 Max's CPU. Now, I keep stressing CPU because the GPU performance is a little bit less impressive. It is by no means terrible, but if the M1 Ultra's CPU is generally up to 95% faster than the M1 Max, its GPU is more like 60 to 80% faster, and sometimes more like 40. The real question isn't why isn't the GPU faster, it's why is the CPU scaling so darn good? Now, there were a few odd exceptions to this scaling. Handbrake, for example, the free video encoding software, generally seemed to treat the M1 Ultra like it was an M1 Max. It only ran most of the work on half of the chip. And we saw this kind of behavior again in some of the AI tests we'd had planned to run, though some of those were unreliable enough we didn't really end up including them in our final results. Rendering an image in Blender, the Ultra did it in 2 minutes, compared to 3 minutes and 27 seconds on the Max and 5 minutes and 30 seconds on the Pro. My PC, however, did manage to do it in just 45 seconds. The other thing we really start to see here from Blender is that in terms of raw computational power, the graphics processor in the M1 Ultra is nowhere near an NVIDIA 3080 Ti, let alone a 3090. In plenty of programs, though, the M1 Ultra was stupendously fast. In Lightroom, for example, I made a catalog with 1024 megapixel raw photos in it, and timed how long it took not only to create one-to-one previews, but also to export the photos out to JPEGs. And in both situations, the Ultra was significantly faster than my desktop PC and blew away both the M1 Max and the M1 Pro. The Lightroom tests showed off another strange behavior of these chips. In the more strenuous tests, like generating previews for 1,000 images, the results were incredibly inconsistent, especially on the lower powered machines. If I ran the same test more than once on my PC, the results didn't generally change by all that much. In the Lightroom preview generating test, the result was actually so variable that at the end of the day, the M1 Pro in the 14-inch MacBook ended up being faster on average than the M1 Max in the 16-inch MacBook. And again, I don't have a great explanation for this. In fact, in another encoding test I did, processing 8K video, the result was so variable that the M1 Pro ranged from 3 minutes to 5 minutes and 30 seconds, rerunning the same test over and over. Speaking of Premiere Pro, since our last tests, new versions of Adobe software are supposed to be better able to take advantage of the hardware acceleration in these chips for ProRes video. This is Apple's proprietary video codec, and it's become widely used in production. It's pretty much an industry standard. Now, when we last tested out these machines, it seemed like the hardware acceleration only really functioned up to 4K resolution. But in our test now, it seems to be functioning all the way up to 8K video. In our last tests of these laptops, I made a bunch of sequences in Premiere Pro that were 10 seconds long and made of increasing numbers of increasingly high resolution clips. Now, when I tested the M1 Ultra, it blew through the sequence made of 4 4K clips and the sequence made of 17 4K clips. It was even able to export out a 10-second 4K MP4 from a sequence made of 5 8K red RAW files in just 18 seconds. So I knew I had to up the difficulty. I cooked up a sequence with 10 8K clips made up of red RAW footage, both from red.com itself and also from RAW film. I also then took those RAW files and I converted them to ProRes to see where the hardware acceleration in the M1 chips was helping out. I also then took those 10 8K ProRes clips and I brought them into DaVinci Resolve and I color corrected them and exported them out as copies and made another sequence with 20 8K ProRes files in it, all playing simultaneously. I now had 3 different 8K sequences made up of 10, 10, and 20 8K clips respectively, and I exported those a bunch to various resolutions of ProRes and H.264 MP4. I then did pretty much the same thing over again with my 5 12K clips from the last time we tested these machines. I'll throw a bunch of results on the screen here, but rest assured, the M1 Ultra is really darn fast. Here's what I learned. In general, there seemed to be a slight performance advantage in exporting to ProRes video, but a much bigger advantage in exporting from it. That is to say, in our test of 10 8K clips, the one where all the clips were ProRes video was much quicker regardless of what you were exporting to than the same sequence made of 10 clips from Red's RAW video format. The Ultra was consistently quicker than my PC when exporting, regardless of the formats, though actually using Premiere Pro felt a little slower on the Mac than the PC. That said, the M1 Ultra was still able to play back a sequence made of 20 8K video clips all playing simultaneously, with only a few dropped frames at 1/2 resolution. Though, to be fair, the PC was able to play this back as well. Last time around, we weren't able to test Resolve or Fusion because, to be honest, we didn't have enough installations to put it on all of these machines. But this time, Blackmagic was able to hook us up with a bunch more program installs, and we tried to put these machines through their paces. In general, the M1 Ultra is crazy fast in Resolve. It was able to play back our 20 clip 8K sequence with no problem at all, and exporting either to ProRes or to MP4 in 8K or downscaling to 4K, all of the exports took pretty much exactly 1 minute, which is fast. In addition to providing us the Resolve software licenses, Blackmagic also sent us a Pocket 6K Pro, which I am filming this on right now. I also used it to shoot our Playdate review, the handheld console from Panic, and I took all of that B-roll, filmed at 5.7K resolution, about 50 minutes worth of it, threw it into a timeline, added some spatial and temporal noise reduction, a little bit of color correction, and exported it all out to a 4K MP4 file. Now, on my PC, that completed in 1 hour, 3 minutes, and 36 seconds, while the M1 Ultra took 1 hour and 42 minutes and 7 seconds. So a good deal slower. While it's still relatively fast, it does suggest to me that once you add a fair amount of image processing, Resolve does benefit from having a pretty beefy GPU to do that computation. I use DaVinci Resolve frequently, but I am a total Fusion novice. But you folks requested, I will do my best to provide. I managed to download and set up Pixar's Robot Room project, which rendered in 3 minutes and 16 seconds on the M1 Max, 2 minutes and 54 seconds on my PC, and just 2 minutes and 36 seconds on the M1 Ultra. The folks at Blackmagic also gave me a Fusion title sequence to try to render, and this one, well, it was weird. I can't find the cause, but Blackmagic may have inadvertently given me a project which is uniquely hard for the M1 architecture to process. For example, I was able to render out this Fusion sequence in just about 4 minutes on my PC, versus 58 minutes on the M1 Ultra and more than 85 minutes on the M1 Max. The problem is even there in the Resolve 18 beta, and I cannot figure out what's going wrong. It seems like Blackmagic may have unintentionally created a very effective memory bandwidth benchmark for the M1 architecture. While trying to render this, the M1 Ultra was pushing more than 725 gigabytes across its GPU, and more than 340 gigabytes per second on the M1 Max. This is versus a theoretical whole chip maximum bandwidth of 800 and 400 gigabytes respectively. Now, trying to run even some of my render tests with the 12K video or the 8K clips, I never saw more than 350 or so gigabytes per second of memory being used across the whole chip. And some of those projects are pushing more than 150 gigabytes of actual, footage through the chip in a relatively quick export. So whatever is happening in this render that is slowing it down so much, Blackmagic is doing an incredible amount of number crunching while it's trying to process it, which just doesn't seem to be happening on my PC, which again did it in 4 minutes. Now, aside from this weird glitch with this Fusion title, overall Resolve did feel super fast and responsive. It was even smoother in the program on the M1s than Premiere was, which, like I said, had a few hitches and slowdowns. Once again, I am not a programmer or a computer scientist, I am a curious video producer, but I was able to get some help to run a bunch of AI and machine learning tests through these chips. TensorFlow's performance has greatly improved in the past few months. Following Apple's recommended installation procedure, we saw about a 10-second improvement, maybe 20%, versus some of the same tests ran back at the end of 2021. Though in some of these benchmarks, the M1 Ultra was not all that much faster than the M1 Max. However, in larger or longer duration tests, like when we set up using Google's BERT language corpus, the Ultra was in fact about twice as fast. We saw some of that performance scaling on display. In general, the TensorFlow models seem to mostly run on the GPU, and some of the difference in performance may have been how well they scaled across all those graphics cores, and how well they also shifted some work to the CPUs as well. So further optimizations may actually still help to improve performance or increase that gap between the M1 Ultra and the Max. Now for PyTorch, which is the Facebook-affiliated Python-based machine learning library, while it is supported, we couldn't figure out any way to get it to do processing on the GPU at all. And in fact, our test results were inconsistent enough that we're not really going to include them here. It is supported on the M1 architecture, but it's clearly still early stages, and TensorFlow just works much better at the moment. I tried to investigate gaming performance as well, but honestly, it seems like you are probably better off getting one of the M1 MacBook Pros if you're interested in gaming. For one thing, finding games with native M1 support is still kind of a problem. There aren't many. Though through emulation, I was able to get Shadows of the Tomb Raider and Total Warhammer 2 to work on the M1 Ultra, and they did both deliver, at 4K resolution, about 60 frames per second with ultra graphics settings. I will say one upcoming game with native M1 support is Baldur's Gate 3, which is hotly anticipated, at least by me. And on the M1 Ultra with maxed out settings, it got about 38 FPS playback, which is decent. Now, the bigger issue really seems to be that as far as I can tell, the Mac Studio can only output 60 Hz video through its HDMI port, which is frankly kind of odd. The M1 MacBook Pros have 120 Hz screens, and they look really good. I have been playing games on the M1 Max and the 16-inch MacBook Pro. I've been doing Desperados 3 and Divinity Original Sin 2 and a few other games, and they look great and actually play back pretty darn well. It's honestly not the worst gaming laptop out there, but the M1 Ultra and the Mac Studio, games that I tried to play on it hooked up to my 4K LG TV, they had this lurching, unsteady quality to them with terrible frame pacing and that hard 60 FPS cap, which it's not great for games. But honestly, if you were spending $6,000 on a high-end Mac for gaming, then you've got a lot of money and strange priorities. So where does this leave us? Well, in some ways, Apple's M1 ecosystem still feels unfinished. Some programs are buggy, some features are missing, and sometimes things are just weird, and you can't really explain why. But when everything is working right, the M1 computers are so fast they can feel miraculous. Still, with AMD's Zen 4 and NVIDIA's RTX 4000 and Intel's 13th gen processors all on the way, that lead may start to shrink soon. Though if rumors are to be believed, the Apple M2 is also imminent. And there are a few ways that the M1 architecture is really remarkable that I don't think those other companies are going to be able to touch. And one of them is efficiency, which, while it's especially important in a laptop, it still arguably matters in a desktop, especially in this day and age where you should see my power bill living here in California. In a straight test of GPU computation, my desktop may be far faster, but anywhere its hardware accelerations can be brought to bear in media work, the M1 Ultra takes the lead. My desktop does also weigh 50 pounds and draw 700 watts of power. The Mac Studio with the M1 Ultra weighs under 10 pounds. I rarely saw it draw more than 150 watts, and it is small enough that, yeah, you can put it on top of a desk. If you are looking for a high-performance Apple desktop, then there's really no other choice. If you just want a fast computer, then it's a much harder decision. But with the Mac Studio and the M1 Ultra, Apple is now firmly back in the high-end desktop game. It might not be quite 3090 levels of performance, but the M1 Ultra is fast enough in all of these tests that it hardly seems to matter. Apple has done an impressive job taking this humble mobile chip and turning it into a desktop powerhouse, and I'm excited to see where they go next from here. Maybe M2 chips with a base of 12 cores in them, or a 40-core M1 Supremo made of 4 Maxes welded together? We will have to see. And I'm also excited to see what the main PC chip makers do to step up their response. Come on, AMD, Intel, and Nvidia, I know you can do it, and I know you've actually got a little bit of a threat here now, so let's see what you make. We will be here to test it all out. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your suggestions of what tests you wanted to see us run. And if there's anything else you want to see us benchmark in the future, or any questions in tech or science you want answered, drop them in the comments below. We do try to read them, and we will see you next time.